Pam Bondi confronted a federal judge, and within seconds, the atmosphere completely changed. What followed next left the entire courtroom stunned, and the video quickly started spreading everywhere. The courtroom was already tense before the hearing even began. Long before the judge entered, the atmosphere inside the federal courthouse carried a quiet intensity. The polished wooden benches were slowly filling with attorneys, journalists, and observers who sensed that the hearing about to unfold might be more than just another routine legal argument. Lawyers shuffled through thick stacks of documents, highlighting passages and whispering final notes to their colleagues. Legal assistants hurried back and forth carrying folders, tablets, and binders filled with research. Every detail mattered in the press section. Reporters checked their equipment and adjusted their cameras, preparing to capture every moment of the proceeding. Some were already typing early notes on their laptops, anticipating the kind of exchanges that could make headlines later that day. In the back rows, spectators whispered quietly among themselves. A few were law students, eager to watch a high-level courtroom argument in action. Others were political observers and legal analysts, curious about how the case might unfold. Everyone seemed to understand that something significant was about to happen. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi. Bondi had already made a name for herself through years of high-profile legal battles and public appearances. Known for her sharp legal instincts and confident courtroom presence, she had developed a reputation for speaking clearly, arguing forcefully, and standing her ground even when the pressure was intense. Those who had watched her in previous hearings knew she rarely backed down from difficult questions. She prepared carefully, understood the details of the law, and delivered her arguments with a calm but firm tone. On this day, she stood at the counsel table reviewing her notes. One final time, several neatly organized folders lay open in front of her. Inside them were legal briefs, highlighted court decisions, and carefully prepared arguments designed to address the key issues of the case. Across the room, elevated above everyone else, sat the federal judge who would oversee the hearing. The judge's bench, framed by the American flag and the official seal of the court, dominated the front of the courtroom. From that position, the judge would guide the discussion, question the attorneys, and ultimately decide how the law should be interpreted. The case itself involved a complicated legal dispute tied to federal authority and constitutional limits. At its core, the debate centered on how far certain government powers could extend under existing law. Both sides had already submitted detailed written arguments to the court, outlining their positions and citing numerous precedents from earlier rulings, but written arguments were only part of the process. The hearing scheduled for that day was meant to give the judge an opportunity to ask direct questions, clarify unclear points, and test the strength of each side's legal reasoning. These kinds of hearings can sometimes be straightforward. Other times, they can become intense, and from the moment the proceedings officially started, it quickly became clear that this hearing would fall into the second category. The judge opened the session by summarizing the central legal issue before the court. Then, after a brief pause, he turned his attention directly toward Bondi. His first question focused on a specific section of the law that played a key role in the case. At first, the exchange between the judge and Bondi remained calm and professional. Bondi stepped forward slightly and began explaining her interpretation of the statute. She spoke clearly, referring to the language of the law itself and highlighting how previous court decisions had interpreted similar provisions. Her argument relied heavily on precedent. She pointed to several earlier rulings where courts had established what she believed were clear constitutional boundaries limiting how federal authority could be applied in situations like this. As she spoke, the courtroom remained quiet. Several reporters typed rapidly, recording the details of her explanation. Attorneys on both sides of the case followed along closely, occasionally glancing down at their own copies of the legal documents being discussed. For a few minutes, the conversation flowed smoothly, but then the judge interrupted. The first interruption came suddenly. Leaning forward slightly, the judge asked a pointed question about whether Bondi's interpretation might overlook a particular detail in one of the earlier cases she had mentioned. Bondi paused briefly, listened carefully, and responded by clarifying how she believed that earlier ruling actually supported her argument. The exchange remained respectful, but the tone had shifted. Moments later, the judge interrupted again. This time the question was sharper. He suggested that Bondi's reading of the law might go further than what some courts had previously allowed. The implication was clear. If her interpretation stretched the meaning of the precedent too far, the argument could face serious problems. A few people in the courtroom exchanged quiet glances. The tension was beginning to build. Bondi adjusted the papers in front of her and prepared to respond again, maintaining the calm, controlled demeanor she was known for. But by now, everyone in the room could feel it. What had started as a routine legal discussion was slowly turning into something more intense. Each question from the judge was becoming more direct. Each answer from Bondi carried greater weight. And with every passing moment, the tension in the courtroom continued to rise. The judge leaned forward and challenged Bondi's argument directly. From the elevated bench, his voice cut through the quiet courtroom with measured authority. He had been listening carefully, occasionally glancing down at the legal briefs stacked beside him, but now his attention was fully fixed on the attorney standing before him. He suggested that Bondi's interpretation of the statute might be stretching the limits of established precedent. It was not an accusation delivered with anger. Instead, it was framed as a precise legal concern, one that judges often raise when an argument appears to push beyond what earlier courts have allowed, but the implication was clear. If the judge believed the argument relied on an overly broad reading of precedent, it could weaken the entire position. For a moment, the courtroom went quiet. The subtle sounds that had filled the room only seconds earlier, the tapping of laptop keys, the rustling of paper, the quiet shifting of people in their seats, suddenly faded away. Everyone seemed to be waiting to see how Pam Bondi would respond. Moments like this often define courtroom hearings. When a judge challenges an attorney's reasoning directly, the response can determine how the rest of the discussion unfolds. Some lawyers grow defensive, others stumble while trying to reorganize their arguments under pressure. Bondi did neither. She didn't hesitate. Calmly, she adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, sliding one document slightly to the side as she prepared to answer. Then she looked up toward the bench and addressed the court. Her tone remained respectful, but there was a firmness in her voice that immediately drew attention. She said the issue wasn't about stretching precedent. Instead, she explained, the real question was whether the court would apply the law exactly as it was written. That distinction was important. Bondi began walking through the structure of her argument, step by step, carefully outlining how previous court decisions had interpreted the relevant legal provisions. She emphasized that those rulings had repeatedly recognized limits on federal authority in situations similar to the one being debated in the case. As she spoke, she referenced specific passages from earlier decisions. She explained how those courts had drawn clear boundaries to prevent government power from expanding beyond what the Constitution allows. In Bondi's view, those boundaries were not optional. They were essential safeguards built into the legal system. Her voice remained steady as she continued, but her words carried weight. Ignoring those limits, she argued, could create dangerous legal consequences. If courts allowed government authority to expand without careful scrutiny, the balance between federal power and constitutional protections could slowly begin to shift. Several reporters in the room typed faster as they recorded her remarks. Even some of the attorneys seated behind the opposing counsel leaned forward slightly, listening closely to the direction the argument was taking, but the judge wasn't finished. After Bondi concluded that portion of her explanation, he pushed back again. The judge tilted his head slightly and posed another question, this one even more direct than the last. He asked whether Bondi was suggesting that multiple earlier court decisions were wrong. The words hung in the air for a moment. It was a pointed challenge. If Bondi answered yes, it could appear as though she was dismissing a long line of legal precedents, something courts are generally reluctant to do. If she answered no, she would need to explain how her arguments still fit within those earlier rulings. A few heads in the courtroom turned. People in the audience glanced toward Bondi, curious about how she would handle the moment. Legal hearings often turn on exchanges exactly like this one. The question wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about how convincingly an attorney could defend their interpretation when the pressure increased. Bondi paused for just a moment. It wasn't a long pause, but it was enough to show that she was considering her response carefully. She briefly glanced down at her notes, then looked back up toward the bench. When she spoke again, her answer was clear and deliberate. She explained that she was not asking the court to reject earlier decisions. Instead, she said the court was being asked to apply those decisions consistently. That subtle distinction immediately captured the attention of everyone in the room. Bondi continued by explaining that legal precedent only works when courts apply it faithfully to new cases. When earlier rulings establish certain constitutional limits, she argued, those limits should guide future decisions, not be gradually set aside when convenient. Her point was straightforward. The argument before the court wasn't about rewriting the law or challenging the authority of previous judges. It was about following the principles those judges had already established. As she finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent. Reporters paused briefly before continuing their notes. Several observers exchanged quick glances. Recognizing that the discussion had reached a critical moment, the judge studied Bondi carefully from the bench. For a few seconds he said nothing, and in that quiet pause, it became clear to everyone watching that the hearing had just reached a turning point. Bondi looked directly at the bench. The room was quiet enough that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed noticeable. Dozens of eyes were fixed on the exchange taking place between the attorney at the podium and the federal judge presiding over the hearing. Standing straight, composed, and focused, Pam Bondi spoke with the kind of controlled confidence that comes from years of courtroom experience. Respectfully but firmly, she clarified her position. She said the court wasn't being asked to reject precedent. Instead, it was being asked to follow it consistently. The distinction might have sounded subtle to a casual observer, but in the world of legal argument, it was a powerful point. Courts rely heavily on precedent. Previous rulings often guide how judges interpret the law in new cases. But Bondi's argument suggested something important. Precedent only works when it is applied carefully and consistently, not selectively. Her explanation shifted the tone of the discussion. Moments earlier, the conversation had centered on whether her interpretation stretched past decisions too far. Now, the focus was different. Bondi calmly began explaining that earlier rulings are meant to serve as guideposts, not shortcuts. Judges examine those decisions to understand how the law has been interpreted before, but every new case still requires careful analysis of the facts and legal context. She gestured lightly toward the documents on the podium. Those pages contained references to earlier court decisions, each one cited to show how previous judges had addressed similar legal questions. Bondi pointed out that many of those rulings had drawn clear constitutional boundaries regarding federal authority. Those boundaries, she argued, existed for a reason. They were meant to prevent government power from expanding beyond the limits defined by the Constitution. Her voice remained calm, but her words carried a quiet intensity. When courts ignore those limits, even unintentionally, the consequences can be significant. Over time, small shifts in legal interpretation can gradually reshape how authority is exercised. Bondi emphasized that this case was not about redefining the law, it was about preserving the balance that earlier courts had already recognized. Several reporters in the courtroom had paused their typing as she spoke, listening carefully to every word. Others quickly resumed typing once they realized the significance of the point she was making. In the rows behind her, attorneys from both legal teams watched closely. Even the lawyers seated behind Bondi leaned forward slightly, their attention fully fixed on the exchange. Moments like this are often the most important part of a hearing. Legal arguments are not just about the written briefs submitted to the court. They are also about how those arguments hold up under questioning, how clearly an attorney can explain their reasoning when challenged directly by a judge. Bondi had just delivered one of the central ideas of her argument. Now, the room waited for the judge's reaction. From the bench, the judge studied her carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't immediately respond. Instead, he sat still for a moment, considering what had just been said. To many people watching, the pause felt longer than it really was. In reality, only a few seconds passed. But in a courtroom, silence can feel incredibly powerful. The judge glanced down briefly at the papers in front of him, scanning the notes he had written during the argument. Then he looked back up. When he finally spoke, his response was surprisingly brief. 7 words. Clear, direct, and completely unexpected by many in the room. He said the court would *** carefully review the arguments before reaching any conclusion. ***. That statement immediately caught everyone's attention. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. But its meaning was significant. The judge had not dismissed Bondi's argument. At the same time, he had not indicated agreement with it either. Instead, he signaled that the court intended to take the matter seriously and evaluate the legal questions in detail before making a decision. In many ways, it was the kind of answer judges often give when they believe an issue deserves deeper consideration. Still, the reaction in the courtroom was immediate. Several reporters resumed typing rapidly, capturing the exact wording of the judge's response. Legal analysts sitting in the gallery exchanged quiet glances, recognizing that the exchange might become one of the defining moments of the hearing. Bondi nodded slightly as she listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't attempt to add anything further. For the moment, the argument had reached a natural pause, but the judge's short response had changed the atmosphere in the room. What had started as a tense back and forth between attorney and judge had now become something more thoughtful. The court had signaled that the issue deserved careful consideration. And that simple statement left the entire courtroom wondering what would happen next. Would the judge ultimately accept Bondi's interpretation of the law? Or would the court reach a different conclusion after reviewing the arguments more closely? No one in the room could answer that question yet, but one thing was certain. That brief exchange, just a few minutes of discussion, had become the moment everyone would remember from the hearing. After that exchange, the hearing took on a very different tone. Just minutes earlier, the courtroom had been filled with a sense of tension. Every question from the bench had felt like a challenge, and every answer carried the weight of defending a complex legal argument. But something had shifted. The brief moment when Pam Bondi clarified her position, and the judge responded by saying the court would carefully review the arguments, seemed to reset the atmosphere in the room. The discussion didn't stop. In fact, it became even more detailed, but the pace of the hearing slowed slightly, and the tone changed from confrontation to careful examination. The judge continued asking questions, but now the discussion was more focused and deliberate. Instead of short back-and-forth exchanges, the questions became longer and more specific. The judge asked for clarification on particular legal points, occasionally referencing earlier cases mentioned during the argument. Bondi responded with the same calm, controlled approach she had maintained throughout the hearing. She returned to the documents on the podium and began walking through several detailed legal points, one by one. Each time the judge raised a question, she answered by referring to prior cases that had shaped the legal framework surrounding the issue. Some of those rulings came from federal appellate courts, while others had established broader constitutional principles that lawyers often rely on when debating limits on government authority. Bondi explained how those decisions connected to the case now before the court. She pointed out how earlier judges had interpreted similar language in the law and described why she believed those interpretations should guide the court's reasoning in this situation. Her delivery remained calm and methodical. There was no sign of frustration or defensiveness. Instead of escalating the earlier confrontation, Bondi stayed focused entirely on the legal framework. She spoke carefully, often pausing briefly to make sure her explanation was clear before moving on to the next point. From the gallery, observers watched closely. Legal hearings like this can sometimes turn into heated debates, especially when attorneys feel their arguments are under heavy attack. But what was happening now looked different. The exchange between Bondi and the judge had evolved into something more analytical. Observers later said that moment earlier in the hearing, the point where Bondi emphasized consistent application of precedent appeared to shift the dynamic of the entire discussion. What had started as a tense challenge turned into a deeper examination of the legal issues involved. The judge, who had initially pressed Bondi's argument with sharp questions, now seemed more interested in understanding the structure of her reasoning. At one point, he asked her to explain how a particular appellate decision related to the constitutional limits she had referenced earlier. Bondi responded by summarizing the ruling and highlighting the part she believed was most relevant. The judge nodded slightly as he listened and wrote several notes on the papers in front of him. Even the opposing attorneys appeared to adjust their approach. Earlier in the hearing, their responses had been quick and direct, sometimes pushing back strongly against Bondi's claims. Now their tone became more cautious. When the judge asked them to address the same precedents Bondi had mentioned, they carefully walked through their own interpretation of those cases, emphasizing different passages and legal conclusions. The discussion grew increasingly technical. At times, the judge asked both sides to clarify specific phrases within earlier rulings. In other moments, he focused on how the wording of the statute itself might influence the outcome of the case. Every answer seemed to lead to another question. Throughout the process, the judge continued taking notes. That detail did not go unnoticed by those watching in the courtroom. When judges actively write during arguments, it often signals that they are carefully weighing the proper information being presented. Reporters seated near the back of the room typed steadily, trying to keep up with the growing number of legal points being discussed. Meanwhile, the spectators remained unusually quiet. Many of them sensed that the hearing had become more significant than anyone expected when the session first began. By the time the questioning finally began to wind down, the discussion had covered a wide range of issues: constitutional principles, statutory language, and the influence of earlier court decisions. It was clear that the court was carefully considering every angle. Both sides had been given the opportunity to explain their positions in detail. Every major point of disagreement had been addressed. The judge glanced once more at his notes, flipping through several pages filled with handwritten observations. Then, he looked up toward the attorneys. hearing appeared to be nearing its conclusion. But, just as people in the courtroom began to relax slightly, thinking the session was about to end in a routine way, something unexpected happened. Because the biggest surprise of the day came right at the end of the hearing. As the session concluded, the judge looked down at the papers spread across his bench and paused for a moment. The long exchange of legal arguments had finally come to an end. Hours of discussion, detailed explanations, and pointed questions had filled the courtroom. Now, the hearing was drawing to a close. The judge lifted his gaze toward the attorneys standing before him in a calm, measured tone. He thanked both legal teams for their arguments. Courtroom etiquette often includes a simple acknowledgement at the end of a hearing, but this moment carried a little more weight than usual. Everyone in the room understood that the issues discussed during the session had been complex and deeply debated. Among the attorneys standing at the podium was Pam Bondi, who had spent much of the hearing defending her interpretation of the law under intense questioning. The judge then made one final announcement. The court would take the matter under advisement and issue a written decision at a later date. At first glance, that statement might have sounded routine. Judges often reserve their final rulings in complicated cases. Instead of deciding immediately from the bench, they review the arguments again, examine relevant precedents, and carefully write a detailed opinion explaining their reasoning. But inside the courtroom, the reaction suggested something more. Several reporters immediately began typing the judge's words into their laptops. Legal analysts seated in the gallery exchanged quiet glances. Even some of the attorneys standing nearby seemed to pause for a moment before gathering their documents. The judge's wording had been careful, very careful. He had not hinted at which way he might ultimately rule. There had been no subtle clues, no clear signals suggesting whether one side had persuaded the court more than the other. Instead, his statement left multiple possibilities open. Later, when legal commentators reviewed the hearing, many pointed out that this kind of neutral response can mean several things. Some believed that Bondi's arguments had clearly influenced the discussion. Throughout the hearing, she had been asked tough questions. Yet each time, she responded by returning to the legal framework she believed supported her position. Her emphasis on consistent interpretation of precedent had shaped much of the later discussion in the courtroom. Observers noted that the judge's questions had gradually shifted toward exploring the implications of those precedents in greater detail. That change, some analysts argued, suggested the court was taking her arguments seriously. Others offered a different interpretation. They said the judge's response simply reflected caution. Complex legal questions, especially those involving constitutional limits and federal authorities, often require careful study. Judges must weigh not only the arguments presented during the hearing, but also the broader impact of their decisions. A ruling in one case can influence how similar cases are handled in the future. From that perspective, reserving judgment was simply part of the process. Either way, one thing was certain. The moment between Bondi and the federal judge had quickly become the most talked about part of the entire hearing. Within hours, clips of the exchange began appearing across legal commentary programs and online discussion platforms. Journalists replayed the moment when the judge challenged Bondi's interpretation of precedent, and the response that followed. The short statement from the bench about carefully reviewing the arguments also drew attention. Some viewers praised Bondi for standing firm and defending her interpretation of the law under direct questioning. They pointed to her calm delivery and her focus on constitutional limits as evidence of a carefully prepared legal strategy. Others focused more on the judge's role during the hearing. They noted how he pressed both sides with difficult questions while maintaining control of the courtroom. His approach, they argued, demonstrated the importance of keeping legal debates centered on reasoning and precedent rather than emotion or political pressure. Different observers drew different conclusions, but one thing almost everyone seemed to agree on was this: that brief confrontation had transformed what might have been an ordinary hearing into a moment people wouldn't soon forget. Sometimes the most memorable moments in courtrooms come not from dramatic speeches or heated arguments, but from short exchanges that reveal how seriously the law is being examined. This had been one of those moments. As the hearing officially adjourned, chairs scraped softly across the floor as people began to stand. Attorneys gathered their documents and placed them carefully back into briefcases and folders. Reporters moved quickly toward the hallway outside the courtroom, eager to file their stories while the details of the hearing were still fresh. Observers lingered for a few minutes, quietly discussing what they had just witnessed. At the center of those conversations was the same question that had begun circulating almost immediately after the judge's final words. When the written decision finally arrives, will that exchange between Bondi and the judge prove to have made a difference? For now, the answer remained uncertain, but the moment itself had already become part of the story. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful courtroom moments and political hearing breakdowns. Also, share this video with friends who enjoy behind-the-scenes insights into major legal and political events. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Which moment surprised you the most? Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching.